the First World War. I mean, this was a conflict that completely redrew the map of the world. But, it didn't just pop up out of nowhere. So today, we're going to break down the really complex web of causes that, back in 1914, threw an entire continent into a war that, well, changed everything.
Okay, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at why Europe was basically a powder keg. Then, we'll get into the fuel. That's militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And finally, we'll talk about the single spark that set the whole thing off, the assassination.
All right, so first up, Europe as a powder keg. You really have to picture what Europe was like at the start of the 20th century. It was tense. It wasn't peaceful at all. It was more like a giant pressure cooker. You had all these powerful nations locked in this super fierce competition for dominance, and every single one was just desperate to prove it was the top dog. And check this out, this postcard from 1914, it just nails that feeling. You can literally see the big European powers in a tug of war. The whole atmosphere was just so thick with suspicion and rivalry. Honestly, it really wasn't a question of if a war was going to happen, but when. Okay, so let's talk about the first big ingredient that was fueling this fire, militarism. And this was a really dangerous idea that a country's strength was all about the size of its army and navy. It led to this constant, relentless focus on getting ready for a fight. So it wasn't just about having soldiers, It meant that military leaders started having a huge say in how countries were run. A totally frantic arms race started, and this obsession with military power just kept pushing everyone closer and closer to the edge. And let's be clear, this was an aggressive arms race. Absolutely. We're talking about countries like Germany, Great Britain, and Russia pouring insane amounts of money into their militaries. They were coming up with new, deadlier weapons and just massively growing their armies, all because they were desperate to get an edge on each other. A perfect example of this, the naval race between Britain and Germany. See, Britain had always had the world's most powerful navy. They ruled the waves, right? But then Germany started this huge shipbuilding program to challenge them, and that created so much hostility. As you can see here, Britain did end up building more of these game-changing dreadnought battleships, but honestly, the damage was already done. The trust was gone.
Okay, next up, alliances. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because all that tension and all that military hard work got organized into two massive, opposing teams through this tangled web of treaties.
So by 1914, Europe was pretty much split into two rival gangs. On one side, you had the Triple Alliance, that's Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, who later became the Central Powers. And on the other side, you had the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Great Britain, who became the Allies. And the deal was simple for all of them. You get into a fight, we jump in too. We've got your back. Now, if you look at this map, try to see it from Germany's point of view. They felt completely trapped, geographically surrounded by France and Russia, two powerful members of the Triple Entente. This feeling of being encircled created this deep paranoia, which only made them more aggressive and defensive. And this cartoon right here, it just shows you the terrifying problem with this whole alliance system. It was basically a tripwire. One tiny, local conflict, like the one brewing between Little Serbia and the huge Austro-Hungarian Empire, could suddenly set off this catastrophic domino effect, pulling the whole continent into a war that nobody really wanted and nobody could control. All right, the next volatile ingredient for our powder keg is imperialism. And this was all about the brutal, cutthroat competition to build global empires. Everyone was scrambling to grab colonies and resources, which of course just poured more fuel on the fire. So, by the early 1900s, you had these massive empires, right? Like the British and the French that stretched all over the globe. But then you have these newer, powerful countries, especially Germany, and they felt totally left out. They wanted their own place in the sun, as they called it. Colonies for raw materials and new places to sell their stuff. And this scramble for colonies was not a friendly competition. Not at all. It was basically a series of intense economic showdowns. It led to constant arguments and near-miss fights over land in Africa and Asia. It just completely poisoned the atmosphere between the major powers and brought them to the brink of war over and over again. And that brings us to the last big long-term cause, nationalism. Now think of this as patriotism on steroids. It's this super intense, often aggressive pride in your own country. And believe me, it was a really powerful and unpredictable force in Europe at the time. Nationalism was kind of a double-edged sword. On one side, it made the big countries always want to prove they were the best, the strongest, superior to everyone else. But on the other side, it gave hope to all these different ethnic groups who were stuck inside big empires, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it made them dream of having their own independent countries. And there was no place where this was more explosive than in the Balkans. Seriously, the region was so volatile, they actually called it the powder keg of Europe. You had Serbian nationalists who had this big dream of uniting all the South Slavic people into one country. The only problem, a lot of those people lived under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you can see how that set the stage for a huge, dangerous showdown.
So there you have it. The stage is totally set. The powder keg is packed full with all this fuel: militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. It was just sitting there, waiting. All it needed was one little spark to set the whole thing ablaze.
And this is the man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He was the heir, the guy next in line to rule the entire Austro-Hungarian Empire. And what happened to him on one summer day? Well, that would become the spark, the immediate trigger that finally pushed Europe off the cliff and into the First World War. So, the date is June 28, 1914. The Archduke is visiting Sarajevo. Now, Sarajevo is the capital of Bosnia, which was a territory that his empire had taken over, but that Serbian nationalists desperately wanted. And it was right here that a group of these nationalists came up with a plan to kill him. It was meant to be this huge statement against Austro-Hungarian rule. What happened that day was just a crazy mix of failure and just world-changing bad luck. The first attempt to kill him with a bomb was a total flop. But then, a little while later, the Archduke's driver makes a wrong turn, and the car stalls. And where does it stall? Right in front of another one of the assassins, a young guy named Gavrilo Princip. He couldn't believe his luck. He just walked up, fired 2 shots, and killed both the Archduke and his wife, Sophie. And that one act of violence, that was it. That was the lit match. The alliance system kicked in just like everyone feared it would. Austria-Hungary, with Germany's backing, declares war on Serbia. Then Russia starts getting its army ready to protect its friend, Serbia. So Germany declares war on Russia, and then on Russia's ally, France. The dominoes just started falling, one after another, fast and unstoppable. So let's wrap this all up. The long-term causes are what made the war possible. And a really easy way to remember them is the acronym MAIN. M for militarism, that big arms race. A for alliances, the 2 rival teams. I for imperialism, the fight for colonies. And N for nationalism, that intense national pride. All of those things loaded the powder keg. The assassination, that was just the spark that finally lit the fuse. And that leaves us with a really big question to think about. With all of these powerful forces pushing Europe towards a cliff, was this horrible war just bound to happen? Or could it have been avoided? If just one of those things was missing, maybe no alliances, or a little less nationalism, is it possible history could have gone down a much more peaceful road? Definitely something to chew on.